Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're the show that takes the info you're curious about, pulls out the key insights, and basically gives you a shortcut to being well-informed.
And maybe learn a surprising thing or two along the way.
Hopefully. So today, we're diving into a set of articles you shared with us. They're all part of the Google Cloud Adoption and Migration in the Enterprise series.
Right, and these were written by Darren Lester, who's a pretty well-known enterprise cloud architect. Lots of people know him as DASBO.
Ah, yes, DASBO.
Yeah.
Good stuff. And what's interesting, you mentioned these are kind of the first articles in a bigger series.
Exactly. It feels like we're getting in on the ground floor of his thinking on enterprise Google Cloud adoption here. Foundational stuff.
Okay, cool. So our mission for this deep dive is to really unpack the main themes DASBO lays out right at the start. We're talking data center exits, mainframe migration strategies. Yes, there's still a thing.
Oh, definitely.
The role of open source, which sounds surprisingly critical.
Make or break, potentially, yeah.
And also what to think about when moving virtual machines, VMs, to the cloud.
Got it. Lots to cover.
All right, let's jump in. First up, saying goodbye to the good old data center.
Yeah, so when you're looking to move off your own hardware, DASBO points out it's not just cloud or nothing.
Right.
If you've got workloads running on-prem, think VMware, maybe IBM Power Systems, mainframes, you've basically got two main non-cloud options for hosting.
Which are?
Your own private data centers, the ones you own or lease, or co-location facilities. Colos, people usually call them.
Colos.
Yeah.
Shared spaces you rent. And how do they charge for that? It's not just rent, is it?
No, not quite. I mean, yeah, you might see pricing based on rack units or how much floor space you take up. But the real key driver, the thing it usually boils down to, is power consumption, measured in kilowatts, kiloBTU.
Power. Okay, makes sense. More gear, more power.
Exactly. Rack space and floor space usually correlate pretty closely with how much power you need anyway.
So if you've got your own private DC running, DASBO has a kind of rule of thumb for when switching to a colo might be cheaper.
Yeah, basically if you have huge data center needs, running your own place can be more cost effective. Scale helps.
But if you're smaller?
Then renting space in a colo is usually the better financial move. Less overhead, shared costs, that kind of thing.
Okay, but here's the twist, right? What happens when you start moving stuff to the cloud? Your private DC costs don't just shrink proportionally, do they?
No, and this is such a critical point DASBO makes. As you migrate workloads out, yeah, your total cost for the private DC goes down. Less power, less cooling needed for the gear that's left. But the cost per kilowatt for the power you're still using actually starts to climb.
How does that work?
Think about the fixed costs, the building lease or mortgage, maybe some core staff, basic utilities. Those costs don't really change much whether the DC is full or half empty.
Okay. So those fixed costs become a bigger slice of a smaller pie.
Precisely. They start to dominate the cost structure as the variable costs decrease.
Which leads to what DASBO calls an inflection point.
Exactly that. It's the point in your migration journey where suddenly it becomes cheaper to move your remaining on-prem stuff into a colo than it is to keep running your increasingly empty and therefore inefficient private data center.
That's a really interesting dynamic.
Yeah.
But deciding to actually do that move to a colo, it's not automatic, I guess.
No, definitely not. DASBO lists a few things you really need to weigh up.
Like?
Well, first, how long do you really need that remaining on-prem infrastructure? Is it just for another year while you finish migrations, or is it a 5-year thing?
Yeah, the effort might not be worth it for a short period.
Right. Then there's your current data center lease. When does it renew? That could be a natural trigger point.
Makes sense. Avoid breaking a lease if you can.
And of course, the actual cost and effort of physically migrating everything from your private DC to the colo. That's not free, takes time and resources.
And DASBO has a way to visualize this decision using cost per kiloW.
Yeah, he suggests graphing it out. Compare your private DC's cost per kilowatt against what a colo would charge per kilowatt.
And he gave an example, right?
He did. Say the colo becomes cheaper once your demand drops below 100 kilowatt. But maybe your private DC is still using 235 kilowatts?
Okay.
That tells you you'd need to get rid of roughly 60% of your current on-prem load before that colo move even starts to look financially attractive on a pure running cost basis.
And that's before you even add the cost of the migration itself.
Yeah, exactly. It puts it in perspective.
So summing up DASBO on data center exit strategy, what are the main takeaways?
It's about really trying to estimate when you'll fully exit, watching those lease dates like a hawk, and planning ahead for that cost inflection point so you can make the call a switch at the right time, if it makes sense.
Got it. Now, some of that stuff left behind might be particularly challenging, which brings us to mainframes.
Ah, the mainframe, yes. Still humming away in many large, long-established enterprises. Decades of history there.
They were the powerhouses, right?
Right.
Known for being super reliable.
Absolutely. Incredible availability, handled massive transaction volumes, really secure for their time. But DASBO highlights they're facing some serious headwinds now.
Like what? What are the main problems today?
Well, a big one is the software. Often legacy COBOL applications, very complex, hard to change, expensive to keep running.
And finding people who know COBOL.
Getting harder and harder. The skills pool is shrinking, plus a lot of the deep knowledge about how these specific systems work is walking out the door as people retire.
The graybeard problem.
You could call it that. Plus, the mainframes themselves aren't very flexible, cost a lot upfront and ongoing, and the operational costs, especially licensing, can actually go up as the hardware gets older.
Wait, the license costs go up with age?
Yeah, it's often linked, which kind of forces hardware refreshes, even if the old box is technically still working fine.
Let's talk about those costs. DASBO really hammered home that the hardware isn't even the main expense.
That's a huge point. He says for a typical IBM Enterprise mainframe over 5 years, something like 80% of the total cost can be down to one thing: the software monthly license charge, or MLC.
80%? Wow. That dwarfs the hardware cost.
Completely. And like we said, that MLC can creep up. So the big insight is, if you can find a way to eliminate that MLC, you're looking at potentially massive savings.
Okay, so if you want to get off the mainframe, what are the options DASBO presents?
He lays out 3 main paths. First, replace. Basically, ditch the old app and build or buy something totally new.
Check it.
Rehost. Keep the core application code, but run it somewhere else, usually cheaper.
And third,
refactor and replatform. This involves using tools to automatically convert the old code, like COBOL, into a modern language, like Java, and then running that on modern infrastructure, probably in the cloud.
All right, let's unpack those. Replace sounds ambitious.
DASBO calls it extremely difficult and costly. Think about it, decades of business logic, intellectual property baked into these systems, often poorly documented, super complex dependencies.
Nightmare scenario.
He even suggests for a big company, trying to replace everything could be a bigger project than the entire rest of their cloud strategy. So, yeah, probably not the first choice usually.
Okay, so rehost, that sounds more practical maybe. Running the old code somewhere else.
Yeah, the idea is to run your COBOL, maybe CICS transactions, in a cheaper environment. 2 main ways DASBO mentions.
Go on.
One is using mainframe emulation. You run software like Micro Focus Enterprise Server on standard x86 virtual machines, either on-prem or in the cloud. You typically migrate the data to maybe DB2 on ZRS to DB2 LUW on Linux VMs.
And the other rehost way
is to cross-compile. Tools like CloudFrame Relocate can take the COBOL source code and compile it into executable Java bytecode that runs on a standard Java virtual machine, again on x86 VMs.
Interesting. So it looks like Java, but it's still the old logic underneath.
Kind of. And importantly, for reducing risk here, Google Cloud offers something called Dual Run. It lets you run the old mainframe and the new rehosted environment side by side for a while, feeding them the same inputs, comparing outputs, making sure everything matches perfectly before you cut over, really reduces the migration risk.
Okay, so what are the pros and cons of rehosting, according to DASBO?
Pros. It can be fast, relatively speaking. You can potentially switch off the physical mainframe much quicker. Big TCO reduction, mainly by ditching the huge MLC license. Lower risk, especially with dual run. And it can be a good first step.
And the cons.
Well, you're still stuck with COBOL, fundamentally. Or code derived from COBOL that modern Java devs might find weird. You still have those legacy code maintenance headaches. And you likely still pay some commercial license fees, like for Micro Focus or maybe DB2 LUW, just not the giant MLC.
Right. So it kicks the can down the road a bit on the code itself.
You could say that. Which leads us to the third option, refactor and replatform.
This is the code conversion one.
Exactly. Using automated tools, he mentions Google's G4, CloudFrame Renovate, to translate the COBOL and maybe CICS into modern Java. The goal is code that looks and acts like a modern cloud-native app you could run in containers, say on Google Kubernetes Engine, GKE.
What are the advantages there? Sounds like the ideal end state.
Big wins. You get rid of the mainframe and the legacy COBOL code base. You end up with modern, maintainable code you can hire from the huge pool of Java developers, potentially break monoliths into microservices.
But the catch?
It takes longer. The automated conversion isn't always 100% perfect. There's usually some manual effort. And validating that the new Java code does exactly the same thing as the old battle-tested mainframe code, that's a major challenge. Really complex testing needed.
So given those trade-offs, does Dasbo lean towards one strategy?
He actually proposes a two-phase migration strategy, which he seems to favor.
How does that work?
Phase 1, rehost. Get the workloads off the mainframe quickly, capture those big MLC savings, reduce risk with dual run, get it into the cloud, maybe running on VMs via emulation or cross-compilation.
Okay, quick wins first.
Then, phase 2, refactor. Now that you've saved a load of money and bought yourself time, then you undertake the more complex project of converting that rehosted code into modern Java, doing the thorough testing, and moving toward a truly cloud-native architecture.
That sounds pretty smart. De-risk it and spread the effort.
Exactly. Take the pressure off.
He also mentioned needing help for this, right? It's not really a DIY project for most companies.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Mainframe modernization is niche and complex. He strongly suggests partnering with specialists who have proven experience. He mentions EPAM, where he works, as a CloudFrame partner, as an example.
Makes sense. So Dasbo's bottom line on mainframes and cloud strategy.
Key takeaway. Mainframe exit isn't just a dream anymore. The tech is there, it's proven, even in tough industries like banking. So your cloud strategy has to address the mainframe question. Are we exiting? If so, how does it fit with our data center plans? And which method, replace, rehost, refactor, or that two-phase approach are we going to use?
Lots to consider there. Okay, let's pivot slightly. How does all this cloud stuff affect?
Well, the devices employees actually use every day, like laptops. BYOD comes up here.
It does. Dasbo contrasts the old world with the new possibilities.
Just the old worldview.
Standard, corporate-issued, lockdown laptops. Company installs all the software. You need a VPN to connect back to the corporate network to access internal apps, and IT has to manage the heck out of that device remotely.
Yeah. Sounds familiar. Secure, but maybe not flexible.
Exactly. But then Dasbo asks these what-ifs that cloud, SaaS, and getting rid of data centers enable.
Go on.
What if you didn't need to install client software because everything's web-based? What if you didn't need a VPN because there are no internal apps left to connect to? What if IT didn't even need to manage the device itself?
Ooh, okay. That opens things up.
It really does. Suddenly, bring your own device, BYOD, becomes a much more realistic option. Let people use the MacBooks or PCs they prefer.
Which, as Dasbo notes, can make employees happier, especially maybe developers. Yeah, potentially boosts satisfaction, flexibility. But you still have responsibilities, of course.
Like what? You can't just let any device access anything?
Absolutely not. You still need to make sure only authorized people access the right apps. You need to protect corporate data, and you need some assurance about the security of the device connecting, even if it's personal.
And that's where the zero trust idea comes in. ZTNA.
Exactly. Zero trust network access. It flat the old model. Instead of trusting devices inside a network perimeter, ZTNA says, trust nothing by default. Deny by default.
Okay. So how do you get access?
Access to specific apps is granted based on who you are, your verified identity, and the context of your request.
Context meaning?
Things like, what kind of device is it? Does it have endpoint security running? Is the OS patched? Where are you connecting from? Policies based on all that. It's much more granular than just, are you on the VPN?
And Dasbo says this can actually get rid of the need for VPNs.
Potentially, yes. If you implement ZTNA properly, it secures access to applications directly without needing to tunnel the device onto a corporate network first.
And Google has a way to do this?
Yeah, he mentions Google's Beyond Corp Enterprise. That's their ZTNA offering.
How does it work, roughly?
It creates a secure connection basically between the user's Chrome browser and the specific service they need. It checks identity, uses multi-factor authentication, can check the device's security posture.
Even if it's a personal BYOD device?
Yep. Works for both managed and BYOD. Plus, it encrypts the traffic, can enforce data loss prevention rules, and gives you central logging. It ticks a lot of the zero trust boxes.
So Dasbo's conclusion on cloud strategy and end-user computing.
He basically says, look at how your cloud strategy can genuinely improve both your security. Maybe ZTNA is the way, and the user experience. Can you enable BYOD safely? Can you reduce the cost and hassle of managing thousands of corporate laptops? These are strategic questions now.
Interesting shift. Okay, let's move to another common cloud topic. Just lifting and shifting existing virtual machines. taking what you have on-prem and plonking it in the cloud.
Right, the rehost strategy, as Gartner calls it. And Dasbo points out most companies already use virtualization heavily. On-prem VMware is huge, obviously, but also Hyper-V, others.
It brought big benefits on-prem, right? Better hardware use, easier management.
Absolutely. Virtualization was revolutionary for data centers. So the obvious question is, okay, I have all these VMs. Can I just move them to the cloud?
The answer is yes, you can. But Dasbo asks,
should you? Or at least should that be your main strategy?
And this VM hosting capability in the cloud, that's infrastructure as a service, IS.
Correct. You get VMs, storage, networking from the cloud provider. You manage the OS and everything above it.
What's Dasbo's take on IS generally?
He calls it the lowest value proposition of cloud. You offload the hardware hassle, which is good, but you're still managing VMs, patching OCs, deploying middleware. It's not fundamentally changing how you operate compared to cloud native or serverless. And you often pay for allocated resources, not pure consumption.
Okay, but surely there are some reasons to do lift and shift. What are the pros Dasbo lists?
Oh yeah, there are definitely pros. It's generally fast and easy, relatively speaking. It gets workloads out of your data center, which might be the main goal.
Quick exit.
Right. Cloud platforms have tools to help right-size VMs during migration. You can automate deployment with tools like Terraform, access cloud marketplaces for images, enforce policies.
What about cloud benefits like scaling?
You get some benefits. Easy load balancing, auto-scaling for elasticity, no more hardware procurement lead times. You leverage Google's massive scale, pay-as-you-go pricing. Yep. Committed use discounts for predictable workloads, cheap spot VMs for fault-tolerant stuff, and crucially, it lets you run those existing legacy apps, monolithic apps, commercial off-the-shelf software without needing to rewrite them.
Okay, sounds like a decent list of pros. But there must be cons. What's the downside of just moving VMs?
Big ones. You're still managing VMs. Patching, security, upgrades, that operational burden doesn't magically disappear. Your infrastructure costs might not even be that much cheaper than on-prem if you weren't efficient before.
And no modernization happens.
None. You're just running the same old stuff in a different place. Still deploying middleware, application software manually or via old tools.
And the licensing thing comes up again.
Yes, big time. Especially for commercial software. On-prem, you might have benefited from VMware's memory overcommit for licensing based on physical cores. In standard cloud IS, you typically lose that. Licensing is often per vCCU.
Which can be more expensive.
Potentially much more expensive. And if your software licenses are fixed based on peak demand, you can't really take advantage of cloud elasticity. Scaling down doesn't save you money on the license.
So the conclusion on lift and shift seems to be useful, maybe necessary sometimes, but watch out for those commercial licenses. Which leads back to
open source. Dasbo keeps circling back to it. You need to tackle those license workloads and find open source alternatives to really win in the cloud.
Okay, but if you are moving VMs to Google Cloud, Dasbo talks about two main ways: Google Compute Engine, GCE, and Google Cloud VMware Engine, ACVE.
Right. GCE is Google's standard IS offering, runs on their infrastructure, uses the KVM hypervisor. Lots of machine types, OS options, you can bring custom images. They have migration tools like migrate to virtual machines. It's the native Google Cloud way.
And GCVE.
That's basically VMware running on dedicated bare metal servers inside Google Cloud data centers. It's VMware's software stack, vSphere, vCenter, vSAN, NSX, managed for you, but running on Google's hardware. You use familiar VMware tools to migrate and manage.
Why would someone choose GCVE instead of just using GCE? Seems like adding an extra layer.
Dasbo outlines a few specific reasons why it might make sense. Maybe you need a really tight hybrid setup with existing on-prem VMware. Maybe your infrastructure team only knows VMware tools and lacks cloud skills.
Yep.
Or maybe you have critical commercial software that only runs on VMware, or relies heavily on that memory overcommit for licensing that you lose in GCE, or you just have an insanely aggressive deadline to exit a data center, and migrating VMware to VMware is the absolute fastest path.
But Dasbo's got a strong view on GCVE as a long-term plan, doesn't he?
He does. He says, look, he loves VMware, it's great tech, but GCVE should absolutely not be your strategic end state for VMs in Google Cloud.
Why not?
Because you're essentially paying for VMware licensing on top of the Google Cloud infrastructure. It's generally more expensive and locks you into that VMware ecosystem within the cloud. He also warns about maybe outsource IT teams pushing for it because they find it easier, not because it's best for your business long term.
Right. Vendor or partner convenience shouldn't drive strategy.
Exactly. So his final lift and shift conclusions are pretty clear.
Go on.
Rehosting or lift and shift should really be limited. Use it for apps you can't modernize that have a defined end of life, or as a purely tactical short-term move if your DC lease is expiring tomorrow and you have no other choice. It's a
weapon of last resort.
That's the phrase. And if you do have to lift and shift, strongly prefer GCE over GCVE unless you fit one of those very specific niche cases or are explicitly using GCVE only as a temporary bridge. Avoid paying for VMware in the cloud if you possibly can.
Got it. GCE first, GCVE only if absolutely necessary and temporary. And think hard before lifting and shifting anything.
Precisely. Which brings us, finally, and perhaps most importantly, to the topic Dasbo says can make or break your whole cloud plan, open source.
He positions it that strongly, make or break.
Absolutely. He says ignoring the strategic role of open source can literally double or triple your IT costs in the cloud. It could completely destroy the financial case for moving.
Wow. Okay, maybe let's just quickly define open source for anyone listening who isn't totally sure.
Sure. Fundamentally, it's about software, where the license gives you specific freedoms. Freedom to run it for any reason, freedom to see the source code and study how it works.
Straight to change it.
Yep. Freedom to modify the code and freedom to share copies, either the original or your modified versions. The exact details depend on the specific license, like GPL, Apache, MIT, etc., but those freedoms are key.
And it's not always free, right? And free software isn't always open source.
Correct, on both counts. Lots of open source has paid support options, and some software is free to use, but you can't see or modify the code, so it's not open source.
Dasbo also mentioned how we got here. From proprietary software dominating.
Yeah, he contrasts the old world of expensive licenses, vendor lock-in, limited choice, with today where so much amazing software is built collaboratively, often based on open standards.
Giving users more choice.
Way more choice. Skills become more transferable, less risk of a vendor disappearing or jacking up prices, and often the software itself is incredibly high quality, maybe even free, with huge communities supporting it.
So what are the big advantages Dasbo sees in using open source?
Number one is often cost-reduced or zero license fees, though paid support is often available and recommended for enterprises. Quality can be higher because more eyes are on the code.
Faster fixes, more innovation.
Often, yes. Bugs and security issues can get found and fixed quicker by the community. Innovation can happen faster, and you avoid vendor lock-in, get more transparency, and the software tends to stick around longer because it's not tied to one company's fate.
And Dasbo listed tons of examples, didn't he? It's everywhere.
It really is. Web servers like Apache and Jinx, app servers like Tomcat, Wildfly, languages and runtimes like Java, Python, Node.js, the Linux OS itself, Android, databases like PostgreSQL, MySQL, data tools like Kafka, Spark, orchestration like Kubernetes, development tools. It's foundational.
He mentioned stats, like Red Hat finding 90% of IT leaders use enterprise open source.
Yeah, and something like 77% of the top websites run on Linux. Even the Mars rover Perseverance runs Linux. It's not niche anymore.
And Google Cloud itself relies heavily on it.
Massively. Dasbo points out many Google-managed services are essentially wrappers around popular open-source projects, providing the infrastructure, management, and support.
He also mentioned contributing back. It's not just about using it.
Right. Contributing can be code, but also bug reports, documentation, reviews, helping govern projects, even financial support. Big companies like EPAM, where he works, are often major contributors.
If developers prefer open source, helps attract talent.
Generally, yes. Developers often want to work with modern open tools. Companies known for using and contributing to open source can be more attractive places to work.
Okay, so we get it. Open source is important, widely used, beneficial. But why is it so critical specifically for your cloud strategy? What's the core reason Dasbo hammers home?
Okay, the headline points are stark. First, those commercial hosting software licenses you're paying for on-prem, they are already likely way more expensive than the hardware they run on.
Okay.
Second, those licenses will likely become much, much more expensive when you try to run them in the public cloud.
And
Third, licensing that software in the cloud basically negates the key cloud benefits of elasticity and pay-as-you-go because your costs get locked in by the licenses.
So what's the single most important piece of advice Dasbo gives based on that?
Avoid moving any commercial hosting software to the cloud. Period. Don't do it.
Which specific software is he talking about mainly?
Primarily things like commercial application servers, IBM WebSphere, Oracle WebLogic, and commercial databases, IBM DB2, Microsoft SQL Server, Oracle Database.
Why are those the big targets?
Because DASBO shows, with an example, those licenses often make up the biggest chunk of your on-prem IT costs already, more than the data center building, the servers, the virtualization, the OS, even the people.
So saving money by closing the data center is small potatoes compared to ditching those licenses.
Often, yes. The real prize is replacing that expensive commercial software with open source alternatives.
And why exactly do those licenses get so much more expensive in the cloud? You mentioned vCPUs.
Right. On-prem, you license based on physical CPU cores, maybe with a nice discount from VMware Overcommit, allowing you to run lots of VMs per core. In the cloud, standard IaaS licensing is almost always per virtual CPU, vCPU. You typically need more vCPUs than you had physical cores, and you lose that overcommit benefit.
So it's double whammy?
Exactly. DASBO uses IBM WAS as an example. On-prem, you pay per physical core PVU, processor value unit. In the cloud, you pay per vCPU PVU. If you had, say, a 4.1 overcommit ratio on-prem,
your licensing costs could potentially go up 4x in the cloud for the same workload.
That's the kind of jump he illustrates. It can be brutal.
Yeah.
Paying potentially 4 times more, and suddenly your costs are fixed by licenses based on peak usage, killing the whole point of cloud's dynamic scaling and pricing.
Ouch. Okay, that really drives the point home. So DASBO's cloud strategy open source conclusions are:
to succeed in the public cloud financially and strategically, you have to ditch those traditional commercial hosting products. Find open source alternatives.
Like what?
Like using cloud-managed PostgreSQL, like Cloud SQL or AlloyDB, instead of Oracle or DB2. Using Tomcat, Wildfly, or Spring Boot instead of WebSphere or WebLogic. He notes the same applies to commercial OS licenses too, though the cost impact there is usually less dramatic than databases and app servers.
Wow, okay, that is a really powerful takeaway.
Yeah.
So just to quickly recap this deep dive into DASBO's initial articles, we've hit on data center exit strategies, the whole mainframe modernization puzzle.
The options there: replace, rehost, refactor.
Yeah.
That two-phase idea.
Right. Then we looked at BYOD, how cloud and ZTNA enable that, improving security, user experience. We covered lift and shift VM migration, stressing it should be a weapon of last resort, and why TCE is usually better than GCP.
Definitely. Avoid that extra VMware cost if you can.
And finally, the absolute critical need to embrace open source alternatives for commercial hosting software to actually make cloud economics work and unlock its benefits.
It really ties everything together. You can't just move the old stuff and expect magic savings if you ignore the software licensing.
And we should remember, these articles are just the start of DASBO series, right?
Exactly. There's likely much more detail and insight to come from him on Google Cloud adoption.
Definitely sounds like it. So maybe the final thought for you, the listener, is this. As you look at your own cloud plans, how could really leaning into open source alternative fundamentally change not just your costs, but your entire approach and ambition in the cloud? Something to chew on.
Absolutely. A strategic question.
Well, that's our deep dive for today. Thanks for joining us.